Hi, welcome back, everybody. There's just a chance for a very quick break there, and I realise I meant to say thank you very much for the three speakers in the first session. That was a really fascinating series of presentations. But we're going to move on now, and I'm completely unprepared. Where is the programme? Who is next? Unless Sue has
it's going to be Marcus Lange's video.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, Babette. Yes, this is Marcus Langes from the Jenner Institute in Germany, who wasn't able to join us today, but he sent us a recorded presentation. So we'll start off with that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you today. That's why I recorded my presentation. And what is my presentation about? I will talk about soil carbon storage and how it is impacted by plant diversity. The results I'm going to present come from the Jena experiment. Name is because it's located in the city of Jena, which you can see in the back. And it's located in a floodplain. Here you can see the Saale River. And so here this valley is the Saale River Valley. And directly to the Saale River, this experiment is set up. In my talk, I will shortly introduce the design and the research questions of this experiment. And then I will present some of our results regarding the soil carbon storage in the Jena experiment. And at the end, I will also talk very briefly about some extreme events, so floodings in this case. So the overall question of these biodiversity ecosystem functioning experiments is what happens to ecosystem functions like biomass production or soil carbon storage when species get lost. So, in the history or in the early days of these biodiversity experiments, we and a lot of other researchers could show that with higher diversity, there is a positive relation to ecosystem functions. So with higher diversity, we will see more biomass production, and we will also see, for instance, more soil carbon storage. And the more recent question in these experiments is, what are the underlying mechanisms for this positive BF relations? So, and we specifically investigate what are the underlying mechanisms that drive the positive or that drive the increased soil carbon storage. So, and how do we do this? The Jena experiment, as I said, is located in a floodplain area, and here many different plant communities were established, and all of these communities have natural occurring or native plants. So, and these belong to the Arenatherion community. So it's Central European Mesophilic grassland. And we established plant communities with a specific or with a plant species gradient ranging from monocultures up to 60 species. And the plants could be grouped into different functional groups like legumes, grasses, small herbs, and tall herbs. And this is a normal situation here in this floodplains. We also have this soil texture gradient. So close to the river, the soil contains really huge amounts of sand, while more far away from the river, the sand or the silt and clay minerals dominate the soil. So that's why all the plots, you can see this schematic here, here's the river, all these plots have been blocked. So here's block 1, then we have block 2, and so on. And this accounts for the soil texture gradient and makes further statistical analysis also much more easy. So just a bit to the history, the Yen experiment was established 2002, and this is very important. It was established on a former arable land. So, and the original plot size was quite huge with 400 square meters. Now it's much more smaller because the management is really labor intensive. So to maintain the plant species gradient several times a year, a lot of student helpers read the plant communities, and also the plant communities are treated like semi-natural meadows here in our region. So it means no fertilization, but twice a year the biomass, the above-ground biomass, is removed, like on natural or like on hay meadows in our region, as I said. So, and how looked the soil organic carbon content along the soil profile before the experiment was established? We see here a very homogeneous distribution of the organic soil carbon. This is due to the plowing of the arable land use. And almost 20 years later, we see that the soil carbon is differently distributed over the soil horizon or over the soil profile. In the top 10 centimeters, we gain carbon, so there is carbon storage, and below 10, below 15 centimeters, we lose some carbon, but this is quite normal. So this profile reflects the root distribution along the soil profile. So we have a lot of roots in the topsoil and only very minor roots here in the depths. But very surprisingly, for me, when I saw this, we are still far away from meadows and which have not been disturbed yet. So this control plots, we have two control plots, they are very close to the Yen experiment. So that's why we assume before the area of the Yen experiment was used as arable land in the 50s or so, the soil looked, the soil profile concerning the organic carbon looked a bit like this. So, but this is an average of all plots, and we could report in the very early days of the experiment already positive short-term effect of soil carbon storage depending on the plant diversity, and this positive effect of plant diversity was confirmed or is confirmed also in the longer term. So what you can see here on the x-axis are the plant species levels, and here the changes of the organic carbon per depth segment. So the colors indicate different depth segments. Green is the top soil, 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 centimeters, and we see with higher plant diversity, higher carbon storage, much higher carbon storage. But in the, as I said, in the deeper soil segments, we see some losses, but very importantly, these losses are less strong with higher diversity. So the plant diversity also diminishes these losses in the deeper soil. And because I introduced this soil texture gradient, and soil texture is often assumed to, on the very long term, or clay mineralogy is assumed to determine the soil carbon stocks. And what we see here is that depending on the soil carbon stocks before the field was established, they have no impact on changes in organic carbon. So the soil carbon stocks in 2002 do not determine, and the changes we see later, and also the block which somehow reflects the soil texture is independent of these changes. So this is just, we found this very important, so to say, because globally the clay content is correlated with organic carbon, but on the smaller spots we don't see this relationship on the local scale. But our question was, how is this plant diversity affect what, or how can we explain it? What are the underlying drivers? And we tested using the structural equation modeling a lot of different hypotheses. For instance, if the carbon inputs drive the carbon storage, if the microbial activity is driving this carbon storage. And what we found was very surprising. Plant diversity increases the carbon inputs to the soil, which is itself not surprising. But this carbon inputs do not directly impact the carbon storage we see. So instead, these carbon inputs fuel the microbial community. Microorganisms are more active, but also plant species richness increases the activity due to a more stable condition. So with higher plant diversity, the microclimatic conditions are more stable, for instance. And with this higher microbial activity, we see a positive relation to the carbon storage. So the higher activity is not responsible for a higher decomposition of organic carbon. Instead, the higher microbial activity transfers the carbon inputs of plants via roots into soil organic matter. And how is this done? So this is nicely depicted by a graphic I was drawing for another publication. So the microbes feed on root exudates, on root residues, and then they die. And this microbial necromass finally contributes to major contents to the soil organic matter. As a last point, I would like to talk about flood events very briefly. So since the INA experiment was established 2002, we experienced 3 floods, and the summer flood in 2030 was the most severe one. But we do not see big effects on the soil carbon stocks. So statistically, we didn't see any impact on such a flood event. But of course, as described in this very nicely paper, we see in the INA experiment effects of this flood, of floods on the plant productivity. But this depends on the severity of the floods. Here, these plots were not, the flood intensity was not very severe. So, and here we saw an increase of plant biomass, plant production compared to the years before. Mainly probably due to, mainly because there was no limit in water and nutrients due to this flood. But here, where the plots were flooded for hardly more than 10 weeks, of course, the plant communities have such a big stress that the productivity decreased compared to the years before. Yeah, and finally, I would like to sum up. So the carbon stocks of the floodplain meadows are very vulnerable to land use change, as we have seen. And if one aims to restore the soil carbon stocks, this is a long-term task, I would say. But of course, soils are probably, depending on the plant diversity or on the plant productivity, carbon sinks. So this restoration might also diminish the increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And as I said, more diverse plant communities can promote a faster transition of the soil carbon stocks towards natural floodplain meadows. And we find as a mechanism that the storage of carbon is rather a function of the microbial community than simply the carbon inputs of plants. But what we did not see was an effect of the flooding events on the carbon stocks in our research here. So I would like to thank you a lot for your attention, and a lot of people, particularly technician Uta. And if you have any question in general to the Jena experiment, or more specifically to our research, here's my email. Yeah, you can shoot me just an email if you would like to, and I'm happy to answer. And I wish you a fruitful and happy meeting. Goodbye.
Thank you, Marcus, in your absence. And as he said, please ask him questions directly, or if you want to put them in the chat saying for Marcus, we can send him an email with a list of questions. I'm sure that he will respond. He's been very interested to be involved. So I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker, who is Steve Beale, Nature Conservation Advisor for the Southwest, working for the National Trust. Steve supports National Trust properties in the Southwest to deliver nature conservation work, including large-scale habitat restoration and creation projects. He has a keen interest in botany and vegetation, and especially floodplain meadows, and is currently training as an ambassador for the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. He's prepared this talk with the help of two other colleagues from the National Trust, Stuart Clark, National Freshwater Specialist, and Simon Barker, Nature Conservation Advisor for the Midlands. So thank you very much, Steve. Off you go.
Thank you, Emma. Can I just quickly check that you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Brilliant, great. Well, firstly, thank you. Thank you for inviting the National Trust to present at the conference today. You've given me an introduction, so that saved me for the first bit of the slide, and also credited Stuart and Simon as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing around floodplain meadow restoration for the National Trust. And providing an overview and the perspectives of what it's like for a major landowner. So it's a slight change of pace in some of the academic stuff, but hopefully it will still be satisfying and interesting for everybody. So the structure today, I'm just going to initially talk about what we're doing internally and what the work for the National Trust for Nature Recovery looks like, and also some of the tensions and push and pulls we find particularly around works on floodplains. Then I want to just quickly talk about how we're identifying the best sites for floodplain meadow restoration and what that process looks like, and then give you some case studies and examples at the end of some of the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years and on into the future. So setting the context internally. So in 2015, the National Trust launched its most recent 10-year strategy, which was asking the question, what does the nation need from the Trust in the 21st century? And for nature, this crystallised itself into what we call our Land, Outdoors and Nature programme, which has three key elements which are underpinned by Lawton principles. So the first of those is improving the condition of our SSSIs, or areas of scientific interest if you're in Northern Ireland, and our priority habitats, so in other words, the better part of the Lawton principles. There's the creating and restoring 25,000 hectares of new priority habitat, which we're planning to do by 2025. We'll have 25,000 hectares underway by 2025, and that is the bigger and more part of Lawton principles. And then finally, there's nature-friendly farming, or as we call it internally, high nature status farming. So it's essentially trying to get 50% of our land into high nature status or nature-friendly farming by 2025. So this is the joined part of the Lawton principles. So the priority habitats are the core areas, and these are the kind of the areas in between where nature can just move through to find the core areas of habitat. But today, and this conference is all about restoring habitats, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So it's what are we doing to restore floodplain meadows for the National Trust? And I think anyone who works in conservation and ecology these days will attest the fact that this is exciting. This is what we're here to do. This is what we love doing, and that's exactly the same for me. And it's definitely what gets a lot of us out of bed in the morning. So the National Trust owns some very significant areas of floodplains and floodplain habitats, but typically of the wider countryside, most of this is improved farmland. So a lot of it is drained, reseeded, depressingly, some of it is slender arable. But all of this means that there's a lot of opportunity for restoring habitats on our floodplains. Now, as you can possibly imagine, in a large organization, there's lots of internal conversations and discussions about what we could do with floodplains. Now, very often they're seen as marginal land. So there's some different competing interests and ideas about what you could do with this so-called marginal land. In terms of nature, which is generally what we're always talking about, there's a range of habitats we could deliver. So obviously a really key one for me and many of my colleagues is the species-rich grasslands, the floodplain meadows, MG4, MG8. But there's also new priority habitat floodplain wetland mosaic, which particularly is suitable for some of our larger areas of floodplain, where it brings together a mosaic of lots of different habitat types to work together. Wet woodland, everyone's talking about tree planting these days, so of course wet woodland's always going to be in the mix, and I've got more on that in a moment. And of course beavers. The National Trust, every other conservation organisation, every other landowner in the country is starting to release more and more beavers, and we're going to see more and more into the future, and they create again these very dynamic mosaics of habitats, of which floodplain meadows can sometimes be a part of. And we also do stage 0 restoration where it is suitable and appropriate, and we've got the ability to actually reconnect the river and its floodplain in a meaningful way. So from a trust perspective, we're generally looking across our floodplains and thinking, we could do all of this stuff. We've got enough land, we can actually do this. But what it's about for us really is about choosing the right habitat for the right place. And inevitably, there can be some tensions between these different types of habitats that you could deliver. So to build on that, the National Trust is a very broad conservation church. Our raison d'etre is nature conservation, but it's not only nature conservation. So we also have to consider history, beauty, access, etc. Or in other words, multiple public benefits. We're aware that most of our floodplains are just certainly not operating in the way they could do. 90% is this figure that is quite often cited. And actually we could be delivering more on all of these counts. And that's what we're certainly looking to do, to try and hit as many of those multiple benefits as possible. And kind of in connection to that as well, some of you may have heard recently about a recent partnership that was launched between ourselves, the Beaver Trust, the Rivers Trust and the Woodlands Trust, called Riverscapes. And this is really about developing thriving networks of nature-rich habitats in our river catchments. Inevitably, there's a focus on trees, particularly with some of the partners involved, and particularly some of the initial trails have all been about planting woodlands to link to the woodland creation offer. But the key thing is actually it's about mosaics of habitats, and floodplain meadows are really in the mix. I just wanted to use that as an illustration because I think sometimes particularly it can be easy to forget that actually what we're talking about are quite complex systems, and we're trying to find ways and means to fit in all of the habitats that are suitable. So with all of this in mind, myself and Stuart Clark and Simon Barker, who internally will have a very particular interest in floodplain meadows, started asking ourselves the question, how can we do more for floodplain meadow restoration? How can we make sure that with all of this noise, all this competing interest inside the trust, we can make sure that we actually deliver the maximum amount of floodplain meadow restoration that we possibly can? So to achieve this, and to support our colleagues to achieve this as well, we set ourselves a series of tasks. And all of this is to ensure that we do maximise the amount of floodplain meadows that we restore. So the first thing we did, or we're starting to do now, really calls back to the previous slides. So on competing interests, so it's about a decision-making process and supporting our teams to make the right decisions locally. So again, it's this idea about right habitat, right place. And the reality is there's no magic bullet. It's all based on good judgment and a good understanding of each site. But for ourselves and the trust, a really key question is how is the land managed? Because most National Trust land is not actually within our direct control. It sits within farm tenancies. So these could be long-term, multi-generational agricultural holding act tenancies, or shorter-term farm business tenancies, which could be 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But either way, the tenant farmers are a fundamental key part of the decision-making process, and they're involved in it and has to be built in collaboration with them. So quite often when we have these conversations with tenant farmers and we ask them, what do you want to deliver on the land? What would work for you? Very often floodplain meadows, unsurprisingly, are an attractive option for them because it stays in agriculture. It's productive agriculture. You're getting a hay crop, you're getting grazing from it. It's also delivering these multiple benefits. So obviously restoring nature, locking in carbon, as we've been hearing about today in the soils, and if you have access, well, floodplain meadows, beautiful access, it's fantastic, people love them. So very often it's an attractive option for farmers compared to some of these other options you may have on a wetland, or a riparian system, which may mean taking land out of agriculture. So alongside asking that question about, what is the possible with the tenancies and the tenant farmers, a really important thing for us is always inevitably to understand what's happening on the site, to have good knowledge of it. So the potential for a site, whether it's a floodplain meadow for us or anything else, really depends on understanding the hydrology of the site, its history. Did it used to be a floodplain meadow in the past? Its local context, what other habitats are surrounding it, and also the planned management in the future. So as we know, some habitats have very specific requirements. For example, floodplain meadows, MG4, MG8, they have very narrow hydrological requirements, and it's the same for some of these other habitats. But there are other habitats, woodlands, for example, which are a little less fussy, and you could potentially plant woodlands in lots of other places. So it's all about understanding which sites can support the narrow requirements of floodplain meadows and targeting these and fitting in the other habitats around them. A third task that we've been looking at, which is about developing a pipeline of projects. So we know that some are ready to go. We've got money, we've got funding, we're about to deliver them, some are delivered. But actually doing this exercise, talking to our colleagues on the ground in the consultancy and National Trust, we've realised that actually a lot of the time what we need is some more feasibility work to understand, are these sites viable for floodplain meadows? So to do that feasibility work, we've been doing a couple of steps in the process. So desk-based, which goes back to our initial point about understanding the site, the decision-making process, what's possible with the tenant farmers, etc. And then undertaking site visits, which is the typical type of work which the Floodplain Meadows Partnership and its staff does, alongside the ambassadors, and going out, visiting a site, meeting the local ranger team, meeting the local farmer, understanding what's happening with the soils there, the hydrology, the nutrients, essentially the eco-hydrology, and understanding, is it possible to restore a floodplain meadow to these sites? If it's not, why not? Is it just a case of the hydrology? In which case, is that something that we can play around with quite easily? Is that feasible, or is it not? So it's a really important step just to understand the site and really understand what's possible there. And then once you've done all of that, the key step after that is to actually get a costed restoration plan up and running, because as I'm sure many people are finding out, pots of money pop up all of the time at the moment. There seems to be constantly there's some new water environment grant coming up, or green recovery challenge, or something like that. But you've got to be ready. You've got to be on the front foot. So we're not on the front foot if we haven't decided what we can do, know it's viable, and actually put together a costed restoration plan so that allows us to actually apply for the funding and have some confidence that we'll deliver what we say we're going to deliver. So it's not all about just identifying opportunities and weighing up decisions versus other habitats. It's also about restoring, sorry, I'm seeing a lot of the chat. Are people having issues with following the slides, or do I need to reload the presentation? I'm on slide 7, by the way. I see some people are, others
I
are
think
not.
I think it's okay, Steve. Some people
Okay.
are managing to keep up, but we do need to keep to time. So have you got much more to say?
No, I'm almost done. That's fine.
Thank you.
I will wrap it up. Yes, so I mean, this is just an illustration of some of the opportunities that we're looking to deliver on National Trust land in the Midlands. Now, what is really exciting for me is looking at the totals of figures that we've got down here. So essentially in the Midlands alone, we're looking to restore 170 hectares of floodplain meadow, which, you know, is quite a significant number, particularly when you take into account that there are less than 3,000 hectares of floodplain meadows in the UK. So once you scale that up and you say this is for the Midlands, we're doing this for Southwest, London, Southeast, the North, etc. I think we're fairly confident that we can add significantly to the area and extent of floodplain meadow habitat in the UK. And just to finish off, just to give you some nice examples of the work that we have been doing, some which are successful, some which are still underway. This is a floodplain meadow up on the River Severn, which is 10 years old. You can see it's doing quite well. Sanguisorba is flourishing. It was green hay. It was started off with green hay from a triple SI. It had some issues to do with docks and weed burdens initially, which might be familiar to a number of people. And there was a lot of pressure to actually spray it off and start again. But Simon Barker, who worked on it and was the advisor, and the countryside manager are very experienced, are very confident in the process. And they said, no, we'll just take our time. This will happen. And look, it's happened. And that for me was a key thing that came out from a lot of those videos that we saw last night as well, was to be patient. And I think now they're actually taking green hay off this site and using it to kickstart meadow restoration on some other sites on that estate. And on the subject also of being patient, this is Places Meadow on the River Avon, or the Warwickshire Avon floodplain at Chalkett Park. A very familiar site to a lot of people, I think. It was a long established but improved ryegrass grassland, and here they've tried a number of different techniques. We've done some plug planting, overseeding, green hay, etc. And it is getting better. You can just about make up some sanguisorba in there as well, but it is slow. So again, it's about being patient and communicating with other people who are maybe not experts in these things, that actually it does take time sometimes. And finally, this is a planned project. So this is Severn Meadows up at Dudmaston Estate. It's a ryegrass lay at the moment, a temporary grassland, and next year we're going to start restoring this to a floodplain meadow. We've just secured some funding for it as well via Highways England. So if you return here in 10 years' time, hopefully you'll see a very interesting floodplain meadow, and there'll be lots of fantastic species to see. So that just illustrates the different life cycles that we're going through at the moment, and this is replicated all over the country at National Trust properties. So that concludes my presentation. So yes, thank you for the time. It was a rapid tour. If you have any questions, I'm in the Q&A, Simon and Stuart are too, but also feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Steve, very much. It's a really nice overview from what the National Trust are doing at the moment. And hopefully Steve will be able to answer some of the questions that are going on in the chat as well. There's been quite a lot coming in, Steve. But for now, we'll move straight on, carrying on this sort of double act of National Trust speakers, floodplain meadows and soil. And we're going to hear now from Felicity Roos, who is the National Consultant for Soils for the National Trust. She also works with farmers and land managers in Australia, Ghana and the UK on the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices and climate change adaptation and resiliency. And she's going to talk today on the National Trust's ambition for soils. So thank you very much, Felicity, and welcome.
I can't see my presentation. Are you putting it up?
It's already on the screen, Felicity. Shall we try to?
I can't see it.
Okay, well, if we take it down again and then and try again. Hazel, can you remove and try again?
I mean, I can talk without it. It'll just not have any pretty pictures.
Well, it's coming up again now.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
I've got a loading circle. I think through short of time, maybe I might just start talking a bit, and hopefully it will appear, and the slides will catch up. But if not, hopefully you can all see the first slide, even if I can't.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, maybe you want to call out, and then we'll move the slides on for you.
Okay. Yes, that'd be great.
Okay.
Right. Yes. Hello. Yeah, so I'm Felicity. I'm the National Soil Specialist for the National Trust, the Nationals in that. And I'm just going to talk sort of briefly about what is our ambition for soil? What are we trying to do? What does the Trust want to do? So sort of next slide. Just very briefly, why is soil so important? So as loads of people have touched on already this morning, you know, we rely on soils to deliver so many ecosystem services that we rely on. And if you think of the National Trust goal to be here forever for everyone, if we want to protect the historic landscapes and cultural landscapes like Stonehenge and all the amazing natural habitat we look after, we need to look after our soils. So that's what I want to focus on. So Stephen very kindly sort of set the scene for what are our ambitions around our land, outdoor and nature objectives, around 25,000 hectares of priority new habitat and protecting our triple SIs. So to try and put that into context, sorry, next slide, please. This is a brief overview of the National Trust estate. So we've got around 251,000 hectares of land, and that includes all the parks and gardens and all the farmland and moors and countryside that we own. So we have about 200,000 hectares of farmland with around 1,700 farm tenants and graziers, about 50,000 hectares of that is common land. And sort of within all of that, we've got, you know, nearly 140,000 hectares of triple SIs and or priority habitat. So we have a lot of land to look after, and I guess, and the scale of it is quite big when we're talking about, you know, what we're trying to achieve over different areas. Next slide, please. So our soil ambition is quite simple, it's slightly high. We want all our soils to be healthy and well managed so they can deliver the wide range of public goods we rely on. But if you think back to that previous slide, you know, the scale of which we're trying to do that at is large. And, you know, we know that some of our soil is not in particularly good condition, and we know that parts of it are in very good condition. And I guess in terms of delivering our ambition, we're promoting, and particularly and talking internally as much as externally, that the 5 principles of soil health, that these are considered in every decision people make when doing something that involves soil, whether that's in the garden, in the parklands, on one of our big upland estates, or on the floodplain meadows. And the 5 principles are limit disturbance, so mechanical and chemical, to protect that really essential structure and biology that everyone's been talking about this morning. Keep the soil covered, so protect it from erosion, which is pretty important if you've got on floodplains. Diversity, so that lovely presentation just now on, you know, the benefit of having 60 different species and that variety of roots and the role of livestock or animals in maintaining that. So sort of how are we trying to do this? So we sort of split our land into 2 broad groups, what we call our sort of our in-hand land, so the land we directly manage ourselves, and then we've got our tenanted land, so that which is tenanted out largely to farm tenants and graziers. So we want to be able to manage our soil, you need to be able to monitor it, to measure it. So we're doing that through a combination of sort of quantitative and qualitative data. So we're using things like VES, the visual evaluation of soil structure, and earthworm counts as sort of as a proxy indicator for soil biology. And they're also looking at chemistry, some of the basics around particularly soil organic matter, it's such a good indicator, but also where relevant, the main nutrients. And, you know, for the scale we're doing it at, VES and earthworms are relatively easy because they're free to do and it just takes the time to go out and dig a hole. But some of that chemistry data you want, particularly if you start looking at things like soil carbon, unfortunately still requires a lab test. And so we're trying to work out, you know, what's the best way to do this at scale. You know, we've got the countryside survey, soil carbon data and data sets like that. And we're trying to build up our own internal data set so that we can sort of compare how do we perform to the national average for different land uses. And we've been really lucky in this recently in that through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, we've secured funding to create a soil baseline at 5 of our sort of large estates, stretching from Wallington in the northeast to Killerton in the southwest. So we're going to get really good soil carbon baselines for 5 quite different estates across England, which will be really interesting. Soil carbon, we don't have a specific policy on soil carbon. We absolutely recognise its value and importance, and you know, the multiple ecosystem services you get from improving soil carbon and soil organic matter content in soils beyond just the sort of the carbon benefits. So we definitely managing our soils as part of, our land management and everything to increase that. But we don't actively have a goal that, we want to increase our soil carbon by X% or anything like that. We are looking at something like the 4 per mil initiative that was launched in France a couple of years ago. So the idea of trying to increase all your soil carbon content by 0.4% per year, but it's not something officially adopted. And in terms of like soil carbon and carbon trading, and I think Jenny Phelps is going to talk on this later, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the market and how it's measured. So it's something we're looking at, and maybe in the future we might get involved in, particularly in terms of reaching our net zero target. But at the moment, we're not. And also working just internally to improve, our understanding of soil health and how to manage soil well, and particularly, into relation like projects, like big restoration projects like floodplain meadows or arable reversion projects. What's the role of soil? And then on our tenanted land, we're sort of grappling with the same issues that many of the large other land estates, like the Duchy of Cornwall and the Clinton Devon estate, are dealing with. Is when you've got a really large estate, how do you baseline all of your tenancies? We're sort of starting slowly with some new tenancies. They come up, so as we get a vacant tenancy and goes out to be advertised, we're starting to create baselines for those. But then thinking of all the 1,500 other existing tenancies we've got, how do we get baselines of those? What are the best ways to work with tenants? Do we write something in a tenancy agreements when they come for renewal? Do we look at the new Sustainable Farming Initiative policy and its soil initiatives in there, and do we try and work with our tenants? And what are the best ways to engage? And so this is something we're talking to the landowners about, we're talking to some tenants about what's the best way to address this. So what's the challenge? Sorry, next slide. I've been forgetting to say next slide because I'm clicking on in my next one. I don't know if anyone's managed to keep up. But I'm currently on slide 8.
Yeah, we are.
Brilliant.
Also.
Thank you very much. So where does this fit in, managing soil health and looking after our soils? Where does this fit into our wider objectives of delivering for people, nature and carbon? Particularly after COVID, the recognition that people need access to green space, and it's one of our founding principles was to provide space and a bit of quiet for people. We're encouraging public access, and the picture shows the walking up to the peak in Wales, whose name I've just forgotten, sorry, but you can see the massive erosional scar there from all the foot traffic. So that we've got challenges like that, when people organise park runs, which are incredibly important, and they often happen through the winter, and when you have wet soil, it's much more prone to compaction. So if we're getting a couple of hundred people running through our parkland at the weekend, what's the soil impact there? How do we manage that? And things like that. And to link this back to floodplains, some of the challenges, when we're restoring floodplain meadows, if you're doing work that involves groundwork, so creating scrapes or digging ponds or stuff, and I've moved on the slide, sorry, how do you deal with all the spoil that's spread? What about the compaction that comes and the groundworks necessary in reconnecting that floodplain to the river and stuff like that? And how do you manage it? I had a conversation with a Riverlands project on the Bure catchment. They had sort of 30 centimetre depth of spoil they wanted to spread on the surrounding field, and that potentially, because you're putting a completely sort of unstructured, mixed up sort of mess as such of soil on a existing sort of soil structure, you're sort of creating a CAF as such. And how do we manage issues like that? And so things like that we need to consider and are working around. And also questions like, if we are putting something in, it is going to be some compaction. Do we need to consider going back in 2 or 3 years, maybe doing some remediation work, or how do we manage those sorts of issues we might create long term? And I think Stephen was talking about the meadow that originally started off with loads of docks and thistles and weeds. Well, docks and thistles can be a sign of compaction. So, there's all these things to consider, and how we manage our soils and how we actually, balance our other objectives with having a healthy soil. I'm almost done. I'm just going to briefly touch on peat because it's vaguely soil related. And just to say that we have, okay, my screen is completely frozen now. We look after around 40 SSSI peatland sites, and like many peats across upland, but we also have upland and lowland peat and lots of bogs and fens and valley mires, and like a lot of peatland in the UK, through past management and different government policies and things, it has been damaged to overgrazing, burning, drainage. And so we're working really hard with different partners, people like Exmoor and Dartmoor National Park, the Peak District, Moors for the Future, and the Yorkshire Water to restore our peat bogs. And the picture you can see is Holcombe Moor, where they've created loads of half moon dams, and there's a proper name for those, sorry, to encourage re-wetting of the area. And so that was just what I had to say on peat. And again, much my last slide, if you've got any questions, that's my email, and I'm really sorry that my presentation didn't work.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you very much for coping in technologically challenged circumstances. We've got time for a couple of questions. If we could put Steve back on, as well as Felicity, because we only have questions for the National Trust. Has anyone got their hand up? No questions. Is there? Oh, there's a couple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could we take a question from Anne?
Yeah, Anne, you can unmute yourself now.
Thanks. Question really to Stephen about your tenants. How much sort of consultation have you done with them, and how, have you presented any of them of this sort of thinking that you've got to them? And if you haven't, what do you think their take on all of this might be? For instance, storing all of the land and the the work that you're aspiring to achieve.
Yeah, good question. I think it is. Those figures out there about what we've been doing, have been available, for a number of years. And I think what it's taken a number of years to kind of work out what the plans are at each individual National Trust property, and then there's kind of a process with the local team to engage with the local tenants to work out what's possible. Because I think a lot of our aspiration, we've been realistic, is around areas where we know there's actually a real opportunity to actually make some change. So bits of land which are either in hand, where we know we can definitely make a change, or where we already have a very good relationship with the tenant and they've expressed an interest in doing something. So we have a fairly high degree of confidence that we can deliver those areas, and then after there we then go and have a conversations with the other tenants and say, okay, what's possible, what's viable, what fits in with your business. And I think what we're finding, as most people are around the country, is that everything is changing with agricultural subsidies. So tenant farmers sometimes coming to us, or very interested in what we've got to say about, or what our ideas are, and understand that it's a route into finances which maybe are being taken away with the end of BPS. So it's generally quite a positive situation.
Thank you, Steve. And is there one more question? Should we take a question from Caroline Hanks?
You can unmute yourself now, Caroline.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question is about the example that Stephen talked about for Charlotte, where several things have been tried over the years and you're gradually seeing things changing. When you talk about patience, how are you deciding what timescale how patient you can be, and what are the indicators for you to decide to intervene a bit more or to try and accelerate? Have you got anything to say about that, please?
Well, with Chalkert specifically, no, because it's not a site I'm involved in. If Simon Barker's here, he might be able to say something, but his internet connection is not always fantastic. So if he's available, then perhaps we could put him on. But otherwise, generally, yeah, I think it's just a case. We have monitoring set up, and we monitor all of our restoration projects. We've got our own methodology, which is very much based on common standards monitoring, which identifies how indicator species are coming in and how abundant they're becoming. And quite often we use that as a yardstick to measure it. And if we start to see things are not necessarily happening, then we ask the question, why not? Do we need to, was it something to do with the environmental conditions that year we did the reseeding? Was there a flood? Was there a drought? In which case, go back and do some more reseeding, or potentially we did something and we didn't necessarily have all of the underlying data about the hydrology, so it could be collecting something more along those lines. But I think it's always a case-by-case basis. And yeah, there's never an easy answer to it, my experience. But yeah, if Simon can come in or not, if we have time, I don't know.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate there's lots more questions, but I'd quite like to wrap up now so we have a decent 10-minute break in between now and the next session. But hopefully Steve and Felicity will be about on the chat, and they can keep an eye on that and answer any more questions. Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you, for sticking with it and giving us such a great overview of what the National Trust is doing. And we will be continuing to work with Steve and Felicity and Stuart and Simon and all the other people from the National Trust that we are doing in order to try and see that vision out. So great. We'll see you all again in, just after 11:30. That gives us 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Bye. Hi, everybody.